The cold on Xylos was different from other places. It didn't just chill the skin, it reached inside, crystallizing hope itself. On this forgotten moon at the edge of settled space, the perpetual twilight cast by its gas giant turned everything into shades of blue and gray. The wind howled through the makeshift structures of the mining outpost, a collection of prefabricated units and salvaged ship parts that had been cobbled together over decades. Kalen walked with his head down, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. His worn thermal coat had long lost its effectiveness, but he hardly noticed anymore. The cold outside merely matched what he felt within. 46 years old by Earth standard, though he looked older, life on Xylos aged people prematurely. Time was measured differently here anyway, by the slow orbit around the gas giant, by the intervals between supply ships, by how long the heating units would last before failing again. He hadn't planned to visit the slave market. His feet had simply carried him there, as they sometimes did when the silence of his shack became too oppressive. The auction had ended hours earlier. He could tell by the lingering stench of unwashed bodies and disinfectant spray, by the trash scattered across the ground, by the emptiness. The auctions always drew crowds. Mining corporations sending representatives to replenish their workforce, private citizens looking for domestic servants, specialized buyers seeking exotic specimens for purposes Kalen preferred not to contemplate. Today's had been one of the larger ones. A colonial transport ship had been diverted to Xylos after a navigational error, its hold filled with all manner of unfortunates. Good business for the outpost. Bad luck for those in chains. You're too late, Kalen. The voice belonged to Forlag, the market manager, a heavy-set man with a perpetual sheen of sweat despite the cold. All gone. Got some good prices, too. Even to defectives. He laughed, exposing stained teeth. Though you never buy anyway, do you? Just come to watch. Kalen didn't respond. He never did. His presence at these events was a mystery even to himself. A ritual of self-flagellation, perhaps. A reminder of what humanity had become in these outer reaches where old laws no longer reached. Actually, Forlag squinted toward the far corner of the market square. Not quite all gone. There's still the worthless one. Kalen followed Forlag's gaze. In the shadows, partially obscured behind empty containers, sat a small cage. Inside was a humanoid figure, so still it might have been a statue. Didn't even bother putting that one up for bid, Forlag said, scratching his patchy beard. No point. It's broken. Something, curiosity, perhaps, or simply the desire to delay returning to his empty shack, made Kalen walk toward the cage. As he approached, details came into focus. The figure was female in form, slight and delicate. Her skin had a faint, silvery pattern that caught what little light there was. Her hair was unusual, fine as spun metal, with an iridescent quality. She sat perfectly still, knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on nothing. "What is she?" Kalen asked, his voice rough from disuse. Forlag had followed him, clearly amused by his interest. "Don't know exactly. Some kind of hybrid or engineered thing from the inner systems. Not quite human, not quite something else. Was like this when they found her in a derelict science vessel. Completely unresponsive. Won't eat, won't drink unless force-fed. No communication, no reaction to stimuli. Barely alive, really. Then why bring her here at all?" Forlag shrugged. The transport captain thought maybe someone would want her for parts or research. Pretty enough, in a strange way. But no one's interested in a specimen that might die any moment. He kicked the cage lightly. The figure didn't flinch, didn't blink. Going to dispose of it tomorrow. Not worth the food it would take to keep it alive. Kalen stared at the motionless figure. Her eyes were open but unseeing, large, slightly almond-shaped, with irises of an unusual violet hue. There was something about her stillness that seemed less like vacancy and more like retreat, as if she had gone somewhere deep inside herself where nothing could reach her. "How much?" The words left Kalen's mouth before he realized he was speaking. Forlag stared at him, then burst into laughter. "For this? You serious, old man?" When Kalen didn't respond, Forlag waved his hand dismissively. Nothing. Take it if you want. Save me the trouble of disposal. But you're wasting your time. It's worth nothing. That's fine, Kalen said quietly. So am I. Fourlag snorted, then called to one of his workers to open the cage. The man did so reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable touching the creature inside. When the cage door swung open, the figure remained motionless. You'll have to carry it, Fourlag said. It doesn't walk unless forced. Kalen hesitated, then reached into the cage. The being was lighter than he expected, her bones delicate under his rough hands. As he lifted her, her body remained rigid, like a doll with fixed joints. He adjusted his hold, cradling her awkwardly against his chest. She was cold, colder than seemed possible for something living. Your problem now, Fourlag said, already turning away. Don't come asking for a refund when it dies on you. Kalen didn't answer. He carried his strange acquisition through the outpost, ignoring the stares and whispers of the few people still out in the perpetual twilight. The girl, he found himself thinking of her as a girl, though he had no idea of her age or even if such a concept applied to her, remained unmoving in his arms, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. His shack stood apart from the main settlement, a deliberate choice he'd made years ago. It was little more than a modified storage unit with rudimentary amenities, a heating element that worked sporadically, a water recycler, a sleep platform, a food synthesizer programmed for the cheapest possible nutrients. The floor was bare metal, the walls uninsulated. It wasn't a home. It was merely where he existed. Inside, he stood awkwardly, suddenly uncertain. He had acted on impulse, something he rarely did anymore. Now he was facing the consequences of that impulse. A catatonic being who required care he wasn't sure he could provide. He laid her carefully on his sleep platform. She remained in the exact position he placed her, unresponsive. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the only sign she was alive. You have a name? He asked, not expecting an answer. None came. Well, I'm Kalen. He rummaged through his few possessions until he found a thermal blanket, which he draped over her. The temperature was dropping as night cycle approached, and the heating element was in one of its temperamental phases. I don't know why I brought you here, he said to the silent figure. Don't expect much. He sat on his only chair, watching her. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't force-feed her, as they had at the market. He wouldn't know how even if he wanted to try. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Perhaps she would simply die, and he would have to dispose of her body, and that would be the end of this strange interlude. The thought brought an unexpected twinge of something. Regret? He couldn't identify the feeling. It had been too long since he'd allowed himself to feel much of anything. He thought of the water and nutrient paste he had stored. Not much, but enough to share for a while. If she would eat, if she would drink. I'll leave these here, he said, placing a container of water and a bowl of the bland paste near the edge of the platform. If you want them. She gave no indication she'd heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. Kalen settled onto the floor, his back against the wall, prepared for a long, cold night. As he watched her unmoving form, memories he'd long suppressed began to surface. The last time he'd cared for someone else. The catastrophic failure of the mining operation he'd been responsible for. The faces of the workers who died when the tunnel collapsed. The investigation. The blame. His dishonorable discharge from the company. His self-imposed exile to this frozen moon where no one asked questions about your past. He closed his eyes, forcing the memories back into the dark corners of his mind where they belonged. He shouldn't have brought her here. He didn't know how to help anyone anymore. It had been a foolish impulse. Yet his sleep finally claimed him, a small, quiet thought formed. At least she wouldn't die alone in that cage. The next days established a routine of sorts. Each morning, Kalen would check if the girl was still alive. Each day, finding that she was, he would place fresh water and food near her, even though the previous day's offerings remained untouched. He would speak to her occasionally, brief, halting sentences about mundane things. The weather, the supplies he needed to obtain, the repairs the shack required. She never responded, never moved from where he had placed her. He had to physically move her limbs each day to prevent stiffness, and the intimacy of this task made him uncomfortable. He would apologize quietly as he bent her arms and legs, turned her to prevent pressure sores. Her skin was always cool to the touch, with that strange silvery pattern that seemed to shift slightly under different angles of light. "I'm going to call you Lyra," he told her on the fourth day, as he adjusted the thermal blanket around her. "You remind me of an instrument I saw once in a different life. All strings and silence until someone plays it." He wasn't sure why he felt the need to name her. Perhaps to make her more real. Perhaps to fill the silence. At night, while she lay motionless on his sleep platform and he made do with blankets on the floor, would sometimes speak of things he hadn't spoken of in years. The accident. The people who died. His failure to save them. She was a perfect confessor, silent, unresponsive, passing no judgment. "I should have seen the signs," he told her on the seventh night. "The structural weaknesses. The company cutting corners. It was my job to know. 23 people died because I didn't pay attention." In the darkness, her silence seemed different somehow. Not empty, but listening. It was foolish to think so, he knew. A trick of his lonely mind, desperate for absolution that would never come. On the 10th day, something changed. Kalen had been sorting through a box of mechanical parts, remnants of his old profession that he occasionally used to barter for supplies. He accidentally dropped a small piece, a crystalline component from an ancient scanner. It struck the metal floor with a clear, ringing sound, and Lyra's finger twitched. It was such a small movement that he almost missed it, but he had become attuned to her absolute stillness, and any deviation stood out starkly. "Lyra," he said, watching her intently. She didn't move again. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, her expression unchanged. Had he imagined it? The isolation playing tricks on his perception? He picked up the crystalline piece and dropped it again. The same clear tone rang out. Her finger twitched again, just slightly, just the smallest tremor. Heart suddenly racing, Kalen gathered the few metal and crystalline objects he possessed and began testing them systematically. A rusted gear, no response. A piece of plastic casing, nothing. A copper wire, the barest tremor of her fingertip. A quartz timing crystal, a definite twitch. "You can hear these," he said, wonder creeping into his voice. "Or feel them, somehow." He placed the timing crystal near her hand. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, with excruciating slowness, her finger extended slightly toward the crystal. It didn't quite touch it, stopping a few millimeters away, but the intention was unmistakable. "You're in there," Kalen whispered. "Aren't you?" That night, he didn't sleep. His mind raced with possibilities. What was she responding to? The sound? The composition? Some electromagnetic property he couldn't perceive? Whatever it was, it had broken through her complete withdrawal, if only for a moment. The next morning, instead of going to the outpost for his usual supply run, Kalen ventured in the opposite direction, toward the abandoned mining tunnels where he had once worked. The company had stripped most of the valuable equipment when they shut down operations, but they'd left behind what wasn't worth salvaging, including raw materials deemed too low-grade to process. It was dangerous to enter the tunnels alone. Some were unstable, prone to collapse. But Kalen knew them better than anyone still living on Xylos. He knew which ones could be trusted and which couldn't. 3 hours later, he returned to the shack with a collection of mineral samples, unrefined or crystalline formations, and a particularly interesting piece of what appeared to be a metallic crystalline matrix that had formed naturally in one of the deeper chambers. Lyra lay as he had left her, unmoving. But when he placed the metallic crystalline sample near her hand, something extraordinary happened. Her entire hand moved, slowly but deliberately, toward the sample. When her fingers made contact with the surface, a faint glow emanated from where skin met stone. It was subtle, a bioluminescent blue that pulsed gently. Her eyes, which had stared unblinking at the ceiling for days, shifted almost imperceptibly toward her hand. "What are you?" Kalen whispered. The glow faded after a few minutes, but Lyra's hand remained in contact with the stone. It was the first voluntary movement she had made since he'd brought her home. In the days that followed, Kalen established a new routine. Each morning, He would venture out to collect different mineral samples from the abandoned tunnels and surrounding terrain. Each evening, he would bring them to Lyra, watching as she responded, or didn't, to each one. Patterns emerged. She reacted strongly to crystalline structures and certain metals, particularly those with complex lattice arrangements. Pure elements elicited little response. Alloys and compounds seemed to interest her more. When she touched something that resonated with her, that strange glow would appear at the point of contact, varying in intensity and color depending on the material. Most remarkably, she had begun to move by herself, small, painfully slow movements, but deliberate ones. She would turn her head to track the movement of a particularly interesting sample. Her fingers would explore the surface of minerals, tracing patterns invisible to Kalen's eye. 2 weeks after bringing her home, he entered the shack to find her sitting upright on the sleep platform. The change was so dramatic that he stopped. In the doorway, heart pounding, her eyes found his, the first time she had made eye contact, and though her expression remained blank, there was awareness there that hadn't been before. "Hello, Lyra," he said softly. She didn't respond verbally, but her head tilted slightly, as if considering him. On the platform beside her, he saw that she had arranged the various mineral samples he had brought in a complex pattern. It wasn't random. There was a deliberate structure to it, though its meaning eluded him. That night, as Kalen settled onto his makeshift bed on the floor, he realized something had changed within himself as well. For weeks, his every thought had been focused on Lyra, on understanding her needs, on finding what might reach her, on witnessing each tiny breakthrough. He had gone days without thinking about the accident, about his guilt, about his self-imposed isolation. He had a purpose again, however small, however temporary. He hadn't helped her out of altruism. He had helped her because something in her abandonment, her designation as worthless, had spoken to his own sense of worthlessness. Yet in trying to reach her, he had inadvertently reached into himself as well, finding parts he thought long dead. As Kalen drifted toward sleep, a soft sound made his eyes snap open. It wasn't loud, just the slight scrape of something against metal. In the dim emergency lighting that served as his night illumination, he saw Lyra kneeling on the floor. She was moving pieces of metal, scraps he had collected over time, arranging them around a central crystalline formation. As he watched, she pressed her palms against the arrangement. The now familiar glow appeared, stronger than before, illuminating her face from below. The metal pieces began to shift, not from mechanical movement, but as if they were becoming temporarily malleable under her touch. The crystalline structure at the center pulsed with light. Kalen held his breath, unwilling to break the moment. For nearly an hour, Lyra worked, her movements becoming more fluid and confident as time passed. When she finally sat back, the glow faded, revealing what she had created. It was a sculpture of sorts, small enough to fit in a palm. A complex, abstract form that somehow conveyed motion and grace despite its static nature. The metal had been reshaped as if it were clay, flowing around and through the crystal at the center, which now seemed to hold a faint light of its own. Lyra looked up, meeting Kalen's gaze. She extended her hand, offering him the creation. Hesitantly, he took it. It was warm to the touch, the first truly warm thing he had felt on Xylos in years. The metal surface was smooth, with intricate patterns etched into it that seemed to change as the light hit them from different angles. "It's beautiful," he said, voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Thank you." She didn't smile. Her face remained largely impassive, but something in her eyes changed, a flicker of connection. In that moment, Kalen made a decision. He would protect her, this strange being who created beauty from discarded things. He would keep her safe from those who might exploit her abilities or harm her for being different. On Xylos, where everything was measured by its utility in the harsh struggle for survival, her gift would be seen as a curiosity at best, a resource to be exploited at worst. He didn't know yet what she was or where she had come from. He didn't know if she would ever speak or if she understood him when he spoke to her. But he knew, with sudden clarity, that for the first time in many years, He cared about something beyond his own miserable existence. It wouldn't be easy. Resources were scarce. His own position in the outpost was precarious at best. But as he cradled the warm creation in his calloused hands, Kalen felt a long-dormant sense of resolution take hold. "We'll figure this out," he told her. Together. The rumors started gradually. Isolated as his shack was, Kalen still needed to visit the outpost for supplies and the occasional repair job that provided his meager income. People noticed the change in him, subtle though it was. He was more alert, less withdrawn. He asked questions about minerals and crystalline formations. He traded for metal scraps and old electronic components that no one else wanted. "Heard you took home that broken thing from the slave market," said Maris, the aging bartender at the outpost's only drinking establishment. Surprised it's still alive. Kalen had come to trade one of Lyra's smaller creations, a simple one he thought wouldn't draw too much attention, for essential supplies. He kept his expression neutral. "She's not a thing." Maris raised an eyebrow at the correction, but didn't comment on it. She examined the small metal construction Kalen had placed on the counter. It was aesthetically pleasing, but didn't display the full extent of Lyra's abilities. "Pretty," Maris said. "You make this?" "Yes, Kalen." "Leet. Old hobby." Maris didn't look convinced, but she named a fair price in trade credit. As Kalen turned to leave, she called after him. "Forlag's been asking about you. And your house guest." Kalen paused, a chill that had nothing to do with the perpetual cold of Xylos running through him. "What?" Maris shrugged. "Don't know. But he's not one to take an interest without a reason." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Be careful, Kalen. Things that are different don't tend to last long here." The warning followed him like a shadow as he gathered his supplies and made his way back to the shack. Forlag was dangerous, not because he was particularly strong or smart, but because he had connections with the corporations that really controlled Xylos and a talent for exploiting anything or anyone for profit. When Kalen returned to the shack, he found Lyra creating again. She had progressed remarkably in the weeks since her first sculpture. Now she could manipulate multiple pieces simultaneously, her hands moving with increasing dexterity as she coaxed metal and crystal into harmonious forms. She still didn't speak, but her body language had become more expressive, and she responded to Kalen's speech with gestures and sometimes a series of taps that he was beginning to recognize as a form of communication. Watching her work filled Kalen with a complex mixture of wonder and anxiety. Her abilities were extraordinary, beautiful, yes, but also potentially valuable. If Forlag discovered what she could do, "We need to be more careful," he told her, setting down his supplies. "No more trading your creations. At least not for a while." Lyra looked up from her work, head tilted questioningly. "Someone's asking questions about you," he explained. "Someone who wouldn't appreciate what you can do. Not the way I do." She stood, moving with the fluid grace she had developed, and approached him. Her violet eyes studied his face with that penetrating intensity that still sometimes unnerved him. She reached out slowly and touched his cheek with cool fingers. The gesture was so unexpected that Kalen froze. In all their time together, she had never initiated physical contact except to hand him her creations. Her touch was gentle, almost comforting, as if she were trying to reassure him. After a moment, she returned to her work, leaving Kalen to wonder at the exchange. Despite her limited communication, he sometimes felt she understood far more than he gave her credit for. That night, as a storm howled around the shack, rattling the poorly sealed joints and driving the temperature even lower than usual, Kalen made contingency plans. If Forlag came for Lyra, they would need to leave Xylos. There was a supply ship due in 3 weeks. With enough trade credit and perhaps a bribe to the right crew member, he might be able to secure passage for both of them. Where they would go, what they would do once they left. These were questions he couldn't yet answer. But staying would not be an option if Lyra's abilities became known. He was just beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep when a new sound cut through the storm's wail, a sharp, metallic rapping on the shack door. Kalen was instantly alert, hand reaching for the cutting tool he kept nearby for protection. No one visited his shack, especially not during a storm and at this hour of the night cycle. "Stay back," he whispered to Lyra, who had also awakened and was watching the door with unreadable eyes. The pounding came again, more insistent. Kalen moved cautiously to the door, cutting tool gripped tightly. "Who's there? Open up, Kalen," came a voice that made his blood run cold. "Forlak." And he wasn't alone. Kalen could hear multiple voices murmuring beyond the door. "It's the middle of night cycle," Kalen called. "Come back tomorrow." "Don't think so," Forlag replied. "I'm quite interested in meeting your house guest properly. I hear she's made a remarkable recovery." Kalen's mind raced. How much did Forlag know? How many men had he brought? The shack had no rear exit, no place to hide. "Nothing to see," Kalen said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's just another mouth to feed." "My mistake." Forlag laukit. "Open the door, Kalen. We can do this easily, or we can do it the other way." Behind him, Kalen sensed movement. Lyra had risen from the sleep platform and was standing in the center of the shack, her posture unusually straight, almost formal. Her gaze was fixed on the door with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "Lyra," he whispered urgently, "hide under the platform." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his instruction. Instead, she raised her hands slightly, palms forward, toward the door. The pounding came again, followed by the sound of something heavy being positioned. They were going to force the door. "Las chance, Forlag kellet." Kalen was out of options. He couldn't fight off Forlag and however many men he'd brought. The storm made escape impossible. All he could do was try to reason with them, try to convince them there was nothing of value here. As he reached for the door lock, a high-pitched hum filled the shack. It emanated from Lyra, or rather from something Lyra was doing. The metal walls of the shack began to vibrate subtly, and the few electronic systems, the heating element, the water recycler, suddenly powered down. Before Kalen could react, a tremendous crash came from outside as the door blew outward with incredible force. A burst of cold air and snow rushed in, along with the sounds of confusion and pain. In the doorway, illuminated by the lights the intruders had brought, stood Forlag and 3 of his men. They were staggering back, clearly caught off guard by the explosive decompression of the door. One was down, struck by the flying metal. "What the hell?" Forlag began, but froze as he caught sight of Lyra. She stood unmoving in the center of the shack, that strange hum still emanating from her. Her hair and the silvery patterns on her skin seemed to be glowing with faint luminescence. The air around her shimmered, as if distorted by extreme heat, though the temperature was plummeting with the open door. "Take her," Forlag ordered, recovering from his surprise. His men hesitated, eyeing Lyra warily. The one still on the ground was groaning, trying to extract himself from under the twisted door. "Now!" Forlag barked, drawing a shock baton from his coat. The weapon sparked to life, designed to incapacitate without killing, standard equipment for slave handlers. Kalen moved to intercept him, cutting tool raised. "Leave her alone, Forlag." "Step aside, old man," Forlag snarled. "You have no idea what you found. That thing is worth a fortune to the right buyer. A living manipulator of matter at the molecular level. The corporations will pay more than you'd make in 10 lifetimes. So he knew. Someone had talked. Someone who had seen one of Lyra's creations, perhaps, or overheard something. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that Forlag had confirmed Kalen's worst fears. If they took Lyra, she would become nothing more than a laboratory specimen or an industrial tool. "She's not for sale," Kalen said, voice steady now with resolve. "Forlag laukit." She was never yours to sell. Abandoned property reverts to the market authority. That's me. He gestured to his men. "Take both of them. We'll sort this out properly at the holding facility." The 2 standing men advanced, shock batons ready. Kalen braced himself for the fight, knowing it was one he couldn't win, but unwilling to surrender without resistance. Before either side could strike, the humming from Lyra intensified sharply. The metal floor beneath them shuddered, then began to ripple like liquid. Forlag and his men stumbled, tried to maintain balance on the suddenly unstable surface. "What's happening?" one of the men cried, panic evident in his voice. The metal walls of the shack began to groan and flex. Pieces of equipment, not bolted down, started to slide across the rippling floor toward Lyra, as if pulled by a powerful magnet. The crystalline and metallic samples Kaelin had collected for her rose into the air, orbiting her in a slow, deliberate pattern. Forlag's face contorted with fear and rage. "Stop her!" He lurched forward, shock baton aimed at Lyra. Kaelin intercepted him, driving his shoulder into Forlag's midsection. They both went down on the undulating floor, grappling for control of the shock baton. Around them, chaos was erupting. One of Forlag's men had fled into the storm. The other was pinned against a wall by floating metal objects that seemed to have fused together into restraints. The man who had been trapped under the door was now unconscious. Whether from injury or from something Lyra had done, Kaelin couldn't tell. "You're mad," Forlag gasped as they struggled. "She's not human. She'll kill us all." "She wouldn't need to if you'd left her alone," Kaelin grunted, fighting to keep the shock baton away from his body. Forlag was heavier and younger, his strength enhanced by fear and desperation. He was gaining the upper hand, forcing the shock baton closer to Kaelin's throat. "I'm going to enjoy this, old man," Forlag hissed. "Then I'm going to collar that freak, and—" He never finished the sentence. A metallic tendril, formed from what appeared to be parts of the shack itself, wrapped around Forlag's wrist. Another seized his other arm. He was yanked away from Kaelin with shocking force, hoisted into the air where he dangled, struggling uselessly against bonds that seemed alive. Kaelin scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. The shack had been transformed around them. The walls had partially collapsed inward, the metal reshaped into sweeping, organic forms that reminded Kaelin of the delicate sculptures Lyra created, but on a vastly larger scale. The floor had solidified again, but with a completely different pattern than before. And at the center of it all stood Lyra, arms outstretched, eyes now glowing with the same blue-white light as the patterns on her skin. "Lyra," Kaelin said softly, approaching her with caution. "It's over. They can't hurt you now." The humming gradually subsided. The floating objects slowly descended. Forlag continued to struggle in his restraints, but his remaining conscious man had gone completely still, eyes wide with terror. Lyra lowered her arms, and the glow faded from her eyes and skin. She looked at Kaelin, and for the first time, her expression changed visibly. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a look of recognition and trust. "We need to leave," Kaelin said, glancing at Forlag. "Now, others will come when these don't return." Lyra nodded, a human gesture she must have learned from him. She moved to the pile of supplies Kaelin had brought earlier and began selecting items with deliberate care, placing them in a pack. Kaelin turned to Forlag, who had stopped struggling and was watching them with a mixture of fear and calculation. "You won't get far," Forlag said. "There's nowhere to hide on Xylos. And even if you make it off Moon, I'll find you. The corporations will pay." "Enough," Kaelin cut him off. "I don't care about your profits or your threats." He considered his options. Killing Forlag would be the safest course, but Kaelin had enough blood on his conscience. "You're going to stay here until we're well away. What happens to you after that is up to you." Forlag's eyes narrowed. "And why would I do that?" In answer, the metal restraints holding him tightened visibly. Forlag gasped in pain. "Because she wants you to," Kaelin said simply. "And I think we've both seen what happens when you disregard her wishes." They worked quickly after that. Kaelin gathered essential supplies while Lyra continued her own mysterious preparations. She had created a small device from parts of the shack, a compact sphere with intricate patterns across its surface that reminded Kaelin of the navigational units old starships used. When she activated it, it glowed with the same light as her creations, projecting what appeared to be a map onto the wall. The storm had intensified, but they couldn't wait. Bundled in every layer of clothing Kaelin possessed, they stepped out into the howling darkness. Behind them, the twisted remains of the shack held Forlag and his men securely. How long the restraints would last after Lyra was gone, Kaelin didn't know, but they had to hope it would be long enough. Lyra took the lead, her glowing sphere providing both light and, apparently, guidance. She moved with confidence through the storm, following a path Kalen couldn't discern. He stayed close behind her, one hand on the cutting tool in his pocket, the other occasionally reaching out to touch her shoulder, reassuring himself of her presence in the near whiteout conditions. They walked for hours through the frozen wasteland. The outpost disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness and driving snow. Ahead lay only the unknown, the vast, unexplored regions of Xylos that the mining corporations had deemed unprofitable or too dangerous. When Kalen's strength began to fail, Lyra found them shelter, a natural cave formation in a rocky outcropping. Inside, protected from the worst of the storm, she created a small heating element from minerals gathered on their journey. It glowed with warm light, raising the temperature to something almost comfortable. "How did you know this was here?" Kalen asked, huddled near the improvised heater. Lyra tapped the sphere she had made, then pointed to her head. "You can sense it? The composition of things, even at a distance." She nodded, then placed her hand on the cave wall. A faint glow spread from her palm, illuminating veins of mineral deposits running through the rock. Some of them Kalen recognized from his mining days, but others were unfamiliar. Complex lattices of metallic compounds unlike anything the corporations had been harvesting. "This is what you've been looking for," he realized aloud. "Not just a way to escape, but something specific." She nodded again, her violet eyes regarding him steadily. Then she did something new. She took his hand and placed it against the wall beside hers. There was no glow from his touch, but he could feel a subtle vibration in the rock, a kind of resonance. "There's something here," he said. "Something important to you." As if in confirmation, she began to arrange the supplies and materials she had brought, creating what appeared to be a workstation of sorts. Her movements were more purposeful and efficient than Kalen had ever seen. "You're planning to stay here," he said, understanding dawning. "At least for a while." She looked at him, head tilted in that questioning way. She pointed to him, then to the cave around them, her expression inquisitive. "Am I staying?" Kalen translated. The question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on escape that he hadn't thought beyond it. Where'd he go if not with her? Back to the outpost, to his solitary existence, to another frontier world where his past wouldn't follow him? The answer came more easily than he expected. "Yes, if you'll have me." Something almost like a smile flickered across her face. She resumed her work, occasionally guiding Kalen to assist her with tasks requiring strength or extra hands. Together, they transformed the cave into a sort of workshop dwelling, with partitioned areas for living and for Lyra's increasingly complex creations. As days passed, Kalen ventured out to scout their surroundings, always careful to cover their tracks and remain undetected. There were no signs of pursuit, but he knew Forlag would not give up easily. The outpost was far enough away that casual discovery was unlikely, but systematic search parties were a real concern. Meanwhile, Lyra worked tirelessly. She created tools unlike anything Kalen had seen before, using them to extract and process specific minerals from the cave walls. She fashioned communication devices that allowed her to share images from her mind, fleeting, fragmentary visions of stars, ships, structures of impossible geometry, and beings similar to herself working with technologies beyond Kalen's comprehension. Gradually, through these shared images and their developing system of gestures, Kalen began to understand her story. She was indeed not human, though humanoid in form. Her people, a species of mineral-based consciousness capable of manipulating matter, had visited the human frontier long ago. An expedition had been separated, their ship damaged. Lyra, still young by her people's standards, had been placed in a protective stasis while the others attempted repairs. Something had gone wrong. The stasis had kept her alive, but disconnected from the mineral matrices her kind needed for consciousness. By the time humans found the derelict ship, she had been adrift, her mind retreated to a tiny core of awareness for decades. The minerals of Xylos had begun to wake her. Kalen's care had provided security for her healing mind. And now, in this mineral-rich cave, she was building something. A beacon, Kalen gradually realized. a way to signal her people if any were still within range. One evening, as they sat beside the heating element, sharing a meal of synthesized nutrients supplemented by native lichens Kalen had discovered to be edible, Lyra suddenly went still. Her head tilted, as if listening to a sound beyond human hearing. Then she rose and moved swiftly to her workstation, where the beacon device, now a complex arrangement of crystalline structures and flowing metal conduits, pulsed with steady light. She adjusted something, and the pulse pattern changed. After a moment, the device responded with a different pattern, one Lyra hadn't initiated. Kalen stood, watching in amazement. It's working? Someone's responding. Lyra turned to him, and for the first time since he had known her, a full, radiant smile transformed her face. She nodded emphatically, then pointed upward, beyond the cave's ceiling, toward the stars. Your people, Kalen said. They're coming for you. The smile faded slightly. She approached him and placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. Her other hand gestured to the cave, to her workstation, to the life they had built together over the past weeks. You want me to come with you? He translated, hardly believing it. She nodded again, her expression earnest. Kalen's mind reeled. Leave Xylos. Leave human space entirely. To go with a being whose nature he still barely comprehended, to a civilization he couldn't imagine? It was absurd, impossible. And yet, what waited for him here? Return to the outpost, to his half-life of guilt and isolation? Flee to another human world, where the same patterns would inevitably repeat. Before he could answer, a distant rumble shook the cave. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Both of them froze, listening. The sound came again, not natural but mechanical. Heavy equipment. Search parties, Kalen said grimly. Forlock found to S. Lyra's expression hardened. She moved to the entrance of the cave, peering out into the perpetual twilight. Kalen joined her. In the distance, maybe 2 hours' travel away, they could see lights moving across the barren landscape, the headlamps of heavy exploration vehicles. How long until your people arrive? Kalen asked. Lyra held up her hands, spreading them in uncertainty. Hours, maybe. Days, possibly. There was no way to be sure. We need to slow them down, Kalen said, mind racing. Buy us some time. Lyra touched his arm, then pointed to herself, then to the approaching lights. No, Kalen said firmly. You're not facing them alone. Besides, they'll have ranged weapons this time. They've seen what you can do up close. You consider their options. We need to use the terrain. I know these formations from my mining. Days. There are unstable areas we could trigger. Lyra's eyes widened with understanding. She rushed back to her workstation and retrieved the sphere she had created earlier. Its projection showed the surrounding landscape in glowing detail, including subterranean features invisible to the naked eye. Together, they identified a potential choke point, a narrow passage between tall rock formations that the search party would likely use to reach their location. The ground there was riddled with natural cavities, precariously balanced. If we can trigger a collapse, Kalen said, it would block their path, force them to find another route. That could buy us hours, maybe a full day. Lyra studied the projection, then placed her hand on a specific area. The image zoomed in, showing a complex network of mineral veins running through the rock formations. She looked at Kalen questioningly. You can affect those from here? He asked, amazed. At that distance. She shook her head, indicating it was too far. They would need to get closer. That means exposing ourselves, Kalen said. It's risky. Lyra touched the beacon, which continued its steady pulse of communication, then made a gesture of protection around it. I understand, Kalen said. We need to protect the beacon at all costs. If they find it, they find you, and they're not letting you go a second time. They packed quickly, Kalen taking weapons and survival gear, Lyra gathering a few small devices of her own creation. The heating element was extinguished, the cave entrance disguised with local vegetation and rocks. If the worst happened and they couldn't return, the beacon would continue its work, calling to Lyra's people. Outside, the eternal twilight of Xylos was darker than usual, heavy clouds blocking much of the light from the gas giant overhead. It would help conceal their approach. They moved swiftly across the frozen terrain, Lyra leading with her sphere to guide them along the safest path. They reached a vantage point overlooking the choke point, just as the search party entered the narrow passage below. From this distance, Kalen could make out 4 heavy exploration vehicles, each capable of carrying multiple personnel. Armed figures moved alongside them on foot. He counted at least 12, too many to fight directly. Lyra crouched beside him, her hands pressed against the rocky ground. Her eyes closed in concentration. The familiar glow began to emanate from her palms, spreading into the rock beneath them, following the mineral veins that networked throughout the formation. Nothing seemed to happen at first. Then Kalen felt it, a subtle vibration in the ground, building gradually. The search party below didn't notice, continuing their advance through the narrow passage. The vibration intensified. Small stones began to shift and roll. One of the figures below pointed upward, alerted by the movement. Shouts of warning echoed up to where Kalen and Lyra hid. Too late. With a sound like thunder, the cliff faces on both sides of the passage began to crumble. Massive slabs of rock broke free, tumbling down toward the search party. The vehicles reversed frantically, trying to escape the collapse, but the narrowness of the passage worked against them. One was caught by a falling boulder, crushed into immobility. The others managed to retreat, but the passage was completely blocked by the landslide within moments. Through a cloud of dust, Kalen could see figures regrouping on the far side. Some were injured, being helped by others. Equipment had been damaged or buried. They would continue the search, he knew, but they would have to find another route, a detour that would cost them precious time. Perfect, Kalen breathed. That should hold them for her. The crack of a projectile weapon cut through his words. A chunk of rock beside his head exploded into fragments. Instinctively, he dropped flat, pulling Lyra down with him. "Sniper," he hissed. "They must have spotted us." More shots followed, chipping away at their cover. Whoever was firing had good equipment, the kind of long-range weapon only corporate security would possess. Forlag had called in serious reinforcements. "We need to move," Kalen said. "They'll be trying to flank us while the sniper keeps us pinned." Lyra nodded, her expression determined rather than frightened. She pointed to a different route than the one they had come by, a path that led deeper into the maze of rock formations rather than back toward their cave. Leading them away, Kalen nodded in understanding. "Good thinking." They crawled backward until the ridge provided enough cover to stand, then ran in a crouch along the path Lyra had indicated. The sound of pursuit soon confirmed Kalen's fears. At least some of the search party had found a way across the blockade more quickly than anticipated, or had been positioned on their side already. What followed was a desperate game of hide and seek across the treacherous terrain of Xylos. Kalen's knowledge of the land, combined with Lyra's mineral sense, allowed them to stay just ahead of their pursuers, using the landscape to their advantage. Twice they triggered smaller rock falls to impede pursuit. Once they crossed a thin ice bridge that collapsed under its own weight after they reached the other side, sending 2 of Forlag's men plummeting into a crevasse below. But their pursuers were well-equipped and determined. Hours stretched on, and Kalen could feel his strength flagging. Lyra, too, showed signs of strain, the glow of her abilities dimmer with each use, her movements becoming less fluid. As night's cycle deepened, they found temporary shelter in a shallow cave, little more than a depression in a cliff face. Outside, the temperature plummeted further, and the wind picked up, blowing ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. It would slow their pursuers, but it also limited their own options for escape. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," Kalen said, voice low as he checked their remaining supplies. "They have resources, reinforcements. We need to get back to the beacon." Lyra nodded in agreement. She projected their location from her sphere, now showing a much wider area than before. Their evasive route had taken them in a wide arc. They weren't far from the original cave, but several search groups were visible as moving lights on the projection, making a direct approach dangerous. Lyra suddenly stiffened, her attention fixed on the projection. Something new had appeared, a pulsing light descending from above, still far off, but approaching rapidly. Is that? Kalen squinted at the image, hardly daring to hope. Your people. Lyra's expression was complex, joy mingled with anxiety. She pointed to the light, then to the search parties visible on the projection, her concern clear. If the humans intercepted her people's arrival, there could be conflict, misunderstanding, violence. We need to reach the landing site first, Kalen said. Warn them. The projection showed the most likely landing area, a relatively flat expanse not far from their original cave. The beacon would be guiding Lyra's people there. But between their current position and that location lay at least 2 search parties, actively sweeping the terrain. We'll need a diversion, Kalen said, thinking aloud. He studied the projection, identifying key features of the landscape. Near one of the search parties was what appeared to be an abandoned mining site, one of many scattered across silos. There, if we could trigger a reaction in the old processing equipment, it would draw attention. Most of these sites still have residual chemicals that can be quite volatile. Lyra considered his suggestion, then modified the projection to show what appear to be underground features, tunnels, perhaps, or natural caverns connecting different areas. There's a way under? Kalen asked, amazed. A path they wouldn't see? Lyra nodded, pointing to a specific location where they could access this subterranean route. With renewed determination, they set out. The entrance Lyra had identified was hidden beneath an outcropping of rock, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. It led to a narrow tunnel, not man-made, but a natural formation created by ancient water flows, long since dried up in Xylos's changing climate. The tunnel was tight in places, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. Kalen tried not to think about the weight of rock above them, the precariousness of their position if a collapse occurred. Instead, he focused on following Lyra, who moved with increasing urgency as the projection on her sphere showed the approaching ship drawing nearer. After what felt like hours of claustrophobic progress, the tunnel widened and began to slope upward. Ahead, Kalen could see a faint illumination, not daylight but something else. They emerged into a vast underground cavern, and Kalen stopped in his tracks, awestruck. The chamber was alive with light. Bioluminescent growths covered the walls and ceiling, bathing everything in a soft blue-green glow. At the center was a pool of what appeared to be liquid crystal, its surface rippling with patterns of light that matched the pulse of Lyra's beacon. What is this place? Kalen whispered. Lyra approached the pool, kneeling at its edge. She placed her hands on the crystalline surface, and a familiar glow spread from her palms into the liquid. The patterns changed, becoming more complex, more coordinated. Kalen understood suddenly. This is connected to your beacon. It's part of the signal. Lyra nodded, not looking up from her work. The entire cavern seemed to resonate now, the bioluminescent growths pulsing in sync with the pool and, presumably, with the beacon in their original cave. On the sphere's projection, the approaching ship altered its course slightly, homing in on this stronger, clearer signal. It would reach them soon, perhaps within the hour, but also visible on the projection were the search parties converging on their original cave. They had found the beacon. Lyra's expression darkened as she saw this. She stood, looking at Kalen with determination, and pointed to the surface above them. We need to go up, Kalen interpreted. Meet your people before Forlag's men can interfere. She nodded, then pointed to a narrow fissure in the cavern wall, a potential route to the surface. Together, they approached it, Kalen squeezing through first to ensure it was passable. The way was tight, but manageable, leading upward through several switchbacks before finally opening onto the surface of Xylos. They emerged less than a kilometer from their original cave, now clearly visible as a hub of activity. Lights from the search vehicles illuminated the area, figures moving purposefully around the entrance. They had indeed found the beacon, and from the organized nature of their movements, they were preparing for something, setting up defensive positions, Kalen realized. They were expecting company. Above, visible through breaks in the cloud cover, a light was descending, brighter now, close enough to make out a general shape. Not like any human ship Kalen had seen. It moved with uncanny smoothness, its outline shifting slightly, as if the vessel itself was fluid rather than solid. "We're too late to prevent contact," Kalen said grimly. "They know your people are coming." Lyra gazed at the approaching ship, then at the human forces gathering near the cave. Her expression was resolute. She took Kalen's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength, then pointed to herself and toward an exposed ridge line that would place her in full view of both the approaching ship and the humans. "You're going to reveal yourself," Kalen said. "Try to prevent a misunderstanding." She nodded, then looked at him questioningly. There was so much in that look: gratitude, affection, concern. Kalen understood what she was asking. This was the moment of choice. Her people were here. Soon she would no longer be stranded, no longer worthless in the eyes of a cruel market. She would return to her kind, to a life and civilization beyond his understanding. The selfish part of him wanted to ask her to stay, to remain in the bitter cold of Xylos with an aging, broken man who had only just begun to feel alive again. But he knew that wasn't fair. She deserved to go home, to be with those who truly understood her nature. "I'll cover you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Make sure you reach that ridge safely." They moved quickly, using the rocky terrain for cover as they approached the ridgeline. Once or twice, they caught glimpses of search party members in the distance, but none came close enough to spot them. The descending ship cast an eerie, shifting light across the landscape, making shadows move in unpredictable ways. As they reached the base of the ridge, Lyra paused. She turned to Kalen, her violet eyes searching his face with that penetrating intensity he had come to know so well. She took his hands in hers, and for a moment, the glow spread from her skin to his, a warm, gentle sensation unlike anything he had felt before. Not quite communication, but a sharing of something profound. Then she released him and began to climb the ridge alone, her form silhouetted against the strange light from above. Kalen positioned himself among the rocks, cutting tool in one hand, a makeshift projectile weapon he had constructed during their journey in the other. From here, he could see both Lyra ascending and the human forces around the cave. The latter had definitely spotted the approaching ship and were taking up defensive positions, weapons ready, equipment aimed skyward. Lyra reached the top of the ridge and stood tall, her arms raised toward the ship. The silvery patterns on her skin began to glow brightly, pulsing in complex rhythms that matched those of the beacon and the underground pool. She was broadcasting her presence, her identity, to those above. The ship slowed its descent, hovering now several hundred meters above the surface. Its shifting form stabilized somewhat, resolving into a more definite shape, a curved, asymmetrical vessel that somehow reminded Kalen of Lyra's creations, but on a massive scale. Below, around the cave entrance, he could see frantic activity. Through binocular attachments to his makeshift weapon, he spotted Forelag, gesticulating wildly, ordering his men into position. Some kind of heavy weapon was being assembled, an anti-aircraft system, military grade. Forelag was preparing to shoot down the ship if necessary. Kalen felt ice in his veins. If they opened fire on Lyra's people, the consequences could be disastrous, not just for those present, but potentially for human-alien relations on a broader scale. He had to stop them. Adjusting his aim, he targeted the power pack of the anti-aircraft system. It was a difficult shot at this distance, especially with an improvised weapon, but Kalen had been a marksman in his military days before turning to engineering. He steadied his breathing, compensated for the wind, and fired. The projectile struck true. The power pack erupted in a shower of sparks, rendering the weapon useless. Confusion spread through the human forces as they sought the source of the attack. Above, the ship had begun to descend again, more rapidly now. It passed over the human encampment without slowing, heading directly toward the ridge where Lyra stood. As it approached, a portion of its hull seemed to liquefy, forming an opening. Light spilled out, not the harsh illumination of searchlights, but a warm, golden glow that reminded Kalen of the light from Lyra's creations. Silhouetted in that opening were figures, humanoid like Lyra, but varying in size and form. They raised their arms in gestures that mirrored hers, and the air between them and Lyra seemed to ripple with patterns of light. Kalen watched, transfixed, as Lyra's people arrived to reclaim their lost child. He should have felt joy for her, relief that his protection was no longer needed. Instead, a profound sorrow welled up within him. This was goodbye. He had always known it would come, yet the reality of it struck him with unexpected force. Movement in his peripheral vision snapped him back to alertness. A figure was climbing the ridge from the opposite side, attempting to approach Lyra, while her attention was focused on the ship. Even at this distance, Kalen recognized Forlag's bulky silhouette. Without hesitation, Kalen broke from his cover, sprinting toward the ridge. Forlag had nearly reached Lyra, something clutched in his hand, a capture device, perhaps, or a weapon. Regardless of his intentions, Kalen would not let him interfere with Lyra's reunion. "Lyra!" Kalen shouted. "Behind you!" She turned, seeing Forlag's approach. Her expression shifted from joy to alarm. She raised her hands defensively, but her attention was divided between Forlag and the ship above, the complex communication with her kind still ongoing. Kalen reached the base of the ridge and began to climb, desperate to intercept Forlag before he could reach Lyra. His aging body protested, muscles burning with the effort, but determination drove him upward. Forlag had nearly reached Lyra now. The device in his hand was extended toward her, some kind of restraint system, Kalen realized, designed to neutralize her abilities. If it made contact, it could sever her connection with her people at this crucial moment. With a final surge of effort, Kalen crested the ridge, throwing himself between Lyra and Forlag. The restraint device struck him instead, sending a shock of paralyzing energy through his body. He fell to his knees, muscles seizing, but managed to grab Forlag's legs, tripping the larger man. They grappled on the narrow ridge top, both weakened, Kalen by the restraint device, Forlag by the exertion of the climb. Below them, the human forces were approaching, weapons drawn. Above, the ship hovered, its opening still extended like an invitation. "She's not yours," Kalen gasped, struggling to pin Forlag's arms. "She never was. Let her go home. Do you have any idea what she's worth?" Forlag's not. "What her kind could give us. Technology beyond anything we've developed. Material manipulation at the molecular level. It's worth more than this entire moon." "That's all you see," Kalen said. "Value. Price. What something's worth to you." He tightened his grip as Forlag tried to break free. "You'll never understand. She's not a thing to be bought or sold." A shadow fell over them. Lyra stood there, looking down at their struggle. Her expression was sorrowful but resolute. She extended a hand, and the ground beneath Forlag shuddered. Metal and stone flowed together, forming restraints that encircled his limbs, pinning him securely to the ridge. "No!" Forlag shouted, struggling uselessly against bonds stronger than any human material. "You can't do this. We found you. We saved you." Lyra shook her head slowly, then turned to Kalen, extending her hand to help him up. The effects of the restraint device were fading, allowing him to stand, though shakily. From this vantage point, he could see the human forces hesitating at the base of the ridge, uncertain how to proceed with their leader captured and an alien ship hovering overhead. "You should go," Kalen said softly to Lyra. "Your people are waiting." She took his hand again, that now familiar glow spreading between them. But this time, something different happened. Images formed in Kalen's mind. Not spoken words, but concepts, emotions, intentions made somehow tangible. He saw himself through her eyes. Not the broken, worthless man he believed himself to be, but someone who had shown kindness when no one else would, who had protected and nurtured a being he didn't understand, who had found value where others saw none. And he saw her invitation to come with her, to join her people, to leave behind the cold desolation of Xylos and the weight of his past. "I can't," Kalen said, his voice breaking. "I don't belong in your world." More images flowed into his mind, The diversity of her people's civilization, the acceptance of difference, the value placed on unique perspectives. There was a place for him, she was showing him. A purpose, not as a curiosity or a pet, but as a bridge between their kinds. The ship was descending further now, its opening level with a ridge top. Figures stood at the threshold, watching, waiting. The patterns of light between them and Lyra intensified, becoming almost solid in their complexity. "They're asking about me," Kalen realized aloud. "You're telling them about me." Lyra nodded, smiling that rare, radiant smile that transformed her face. She released his hand and gestured toward the ship, the invitation clear. Kalen looked back at Forelag, still struggling against his bonds, at the human forces gathered below, weapons ready but hesitant. He looked at the barren landscape of Xylos, the twilight world that had been his purgatory for years. Then he looked at Lyra, at the golden light spilling from the ship behind her, at the possibility of something he had long since abandoned. A future. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm just an old man. Useless. Worthless, by most standards." Lyra shook her head firmly, touching his chest over his heart. The message was clear. Worth was not determined by market value or utility. Worth came from within, from connection, from the capacity to care for something beyond oneself. It was the lesson she had taught him over these past weeks, a lesson he had begun to learn when he first saw her in that cage and felt that inexplicable impulse to save something deemed worthless. Behind them, shouts arose from the human forces. Reinforcements had arrived. Time was running out. "All right," Kalen said, making his decision. "I'll come with you." Together, they walked toward the ship. As they approached the threshold, the figures within became clearer, beings similar to Lyra in their basic form, but with variations in size, coloration, and the patterns that adorned their skin. They greeted Lyra with gestures of welcome, light flowing between them in complex exchanges. One of them stepped forward, regarding Kalen with eyes similar to Lyra's but deeper in color, ancient in their wisdom. It extended a hand in a surprisingly human gesture. Kalen hesitated only briefly before taking it. The same sensation he had experienced with Lyra spread through him, but stronger, more focused. Images formed in his mind, not of the past or present, but of possibilities. A life among these beings, learning, teaching, building understanding between two very different kinds. As he stepped fully into the ship, Kalen looked back one last time at Xylos. Forelag was still shouting, his words lost to the distance. The human forces were advancing up the ridge, but too late. The opening in the ship's hull was already beginning to close. The last thing Kalen saw of his old world was the desolate landscape where he had been exiled, where he had found and rescued a being deemed worthless, and where, in turn, he had been rescued himself. Then the hull sealed completely, and the ship began to rise. Inside, it was warm for the first time in years. Lyra stood beside him, her hand in his, as they ascended toward the stars. In a market on Xylos, all the slaves had been sold that day. All except one, the one they called worthless. And only a human had bought her, though no credits had changed hands. It had been the most valuable transaction of Kalen's life, costing nothing, yet gaining everything. As the ship broke through Xylos's atmosphere into the starlit void beyond, Kalen felt something he had thought lost forever: hope. Not all things of value could be priced, he now understood. Some things, like kindness, purpose, and connection, were beyond measure, yet worth everything.